Ever catch yourself kind of spiraling, like down into this like super dark what if scenarios? Like, what are the absolute worst things imaginable?
Oh, yeah,
I
definitely.
feel like we all do that sometimes.
It's like a morbid curiosity almost.
Totally. And that's kind of where we're headed today because you guys, the listeners, shared something fascinating with us. If not a little disturbing, I'll admit. It's like a crowdsourced list, in a way, of the top 10 worst things ever.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And our deep dive today isn't about like dwelling in all the negativity, but really taking apart, dissecting what these different perspectives tell us about how we see, how we understand those like darker sides of existing, of being human.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting premise because you're right. It's not about celebrating the bad. It's about understanding why we even perceive these things as bad. What is it about the human experience that makes us even have these concepts of worst?
Exactly.
So what kind of stuff are we looking at here? What did people come up with?
Oh, it's quite a spectrum. We're talking big, almost abstract evils like war, the concept of hell, all the way down to these really personal, immediate struggles like being sick, feeling overlooked.
Right, so huge scope, but also those everyday things that just grind you down.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It's a real testament to the diversity of ways we experience and define suffering, what it means to be human in a world where these things exist.
Mm-hmm.
We're not building some definitive ranking of like horror, a hierarchy of awfulness. What we're after is understanding those lenses.
Right.
How are these experiences filtered?
Exactly.
What are the values, the fears that are driving these reactions?
I mean, you got to figure there's some core stuff in there, like what makes us tick, what keeps us up at night, right?
Absolutely. So, ready to plunge in?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with war.
Okay. Always a cheery topic,
Right.
But a big one, obviously. So what's the take here?
The perspective on war in this collection is, it's intense. It's not just presented as a terrible event. It's almost like an inherent part of who we are as humans, like a fundamental drive towards dominance. And it references Lord of the Flies,
Oh, interesting.
which I think is a really interesting choice.
Yeah, that book always makes you think, for sure. So are they saying that we're all just savages deep down?
In a way, yeah. Like the idea is that civilization, it's fragile.
Right.
Underneath, there's this more chaotic, even savage nature that's always lurking.
Like we can't escape it.
Right.
Okay, so that's pretty bleak.
It is. It's a bleak picture. And it goes on to say that, like, the pursuit of world peace, it's basically futile.
Oh,
Like a
wow.
naive dream.
That we're doomed to repeat history, all that.
Yeah. Up against these, like, deep-seated primitive instincts.
So much for all the Imagine posters, huh?
Right.
Okay, but that's not all, right?
No, it goes further.
Oh, boy.
It even challenges the idea of innocence in war.
What do you mean?
The argument is that those who actually fight, they're not just victims, right? They're often driven by things like nationalism, pride, and they even find, like, purpose in the conflict.
Okay, I mean, that's complex.
It is.
You don't usually think about it that way.
It's a more complicated view than just good versus evil.
It kind of muddies the waters a bit.
It does, right? It makes you consider the agency of people in these conflicts.
So it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Like they're not just pawns in a game.
Definitely gives you pause.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
Right.
Let's talk about something we all know is coming. Death.
Ah, the big D.
Right. Inescapable. Right.
Yeah. The source we have here, it's very direct. It says death is bad simply because, well, dying is part of it.
I mean, fair enough. Not exactly a pleasant process.
No.
But then everyone knows that, right? What else did they say?
But what I think is really insightful is the observation that our understanding, or maybe acceptance is a better word, of death, it's constantly being shaped by what we experience. Like everything from stepping on a bug as a kid to, the loss of someone you love. Oh, yeah. Death is everywhere, isn't it?
It is. It's all around us.
Yeah.
And even if we can't fully wrap our heads around it, it's shaping us.
Like it's there in the background, influencing how we think about the world, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And then there's this really personal story that's shared about losing a mother to cancer.
Oh, wow.
And it's not straightforward. It's not simple.
How so?
The mother was also struggling with addiction.
Oh, man.
So it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the family's grief, right?
Right.
And the way they all reacted, it's so different.
In what way?
The father and the sister, they were just devastated, consumed by grief. But the author, the person who shared this, they were trying to hold it all in.
Trying to stay strong.
Yeah. But they also talk about feeling this like continued connection with their mom.
That's interesting, like
Yeah.
different ways of coping.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it really emphasizes how unique and personal grief is.
There's no right way to do it.
No. And the source makes a really good point. We can try to ignore death, but we can't escape its effect on us.
Nope. It touches everything eventually. Okay, so moving on, we have to talk about this one. Murder. It's a tough subject,
Yeah, definitely.
but important to engage with, right?
Absolutely. And the overwhelming feeling that comes through in this collection is fear, like a deep fear, and just this struggle to even comprehend the act.
Like, how can one person do that to another?
Right. The source grapples with the potential motivations, like everything from brain problems to greed,
Right.
or even scarier, just because.
Chilling.
It is. And it speaks to this fundamental breakdown in how we understand human behavior, you know?
Yeah, like it shatters our sense of how the world works.
Exactly. And there's this longing for a world without it, but it's coupled with this frustrated confusion. Like, how can someone take a life and not feel just crushed by guilt?
Right, where's the remorse? The source uses some pretty strong language, too.
Oh, yeah, they don't hold back. They call murderers insane, sadistic losers.
Oh.
It's a very visceral reaction.
Definitely.
Like, it cuts to the core of our sense of justice, our empathy.
Yeah, it's a fundamental violation, taking a life. Okay, so let's take a bit of a turn now. Let's talk about hell.
All right, a different kind of heavy.
For sure.
This viewpoint comes from a place of very strong Christian faith, and it's really straightforward. It says hell is the worst thing forever.
No mincing words there.
No, and it's based on a specific theological framework. You know, salvation through Jesus Christ, the Lamb's Book of Life, all of that.
So within that belief system, eternal damnation, being separated from God, that's the ultimate bad ending.
Exactly. It's about sin and redemption, and the stakes are eternal.
High stakes indeed. Okay, from eternal consequences to very real-world conflicts. What about terrorism?
So the source explains terrorism as coming from this fundamental clash with other societies, other cultures, like a disagreement on how to live.
So like prejudice, but on a global scale.
Yeah, that's how it's framed.
Okay, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Right.
And of course, they talk about 9/11.
Yeah. There's a total rejection of those conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes the reality of the thousands of lives lost and the impact it had on the U.S.
Yeah, that feeling of vulnerability. Like even in a safe place, innocent people can be targets. It's scary.
It is.
And it makes you question that whole freedom fighters label, right?
Absolutely. When their actions cause so much suffering.
Yeah. Hard to reconcile.
Okay, up next, something that I think a lot of people fear, cancer.
Yeah, a tough one. And the argument here is that cancer might be worse than death itself.
Oh, wow. Because of the suffering.
Yeah, because of the prolonged suffering it inflicts. Not just on the patient, but everyone who loves them.
Witnessing it firsthand is hard.
It is. And the source doesn't shy away from the emotion. They call it the most horrible disease, and even talk about considering suicide if they were ever diagnosed.
That's heavy. You can really feel the fear there.
Yeah. It's the fear of that long, drawn-out fight, the potential for relentless pain, the feeling of helplessness.
It's terrifying for a lot of people. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to something more common but still universally hated. Being sick.
Oh, tell me about it. The sniffles, the coughs, the aches.
Right.
The worst.
And what's interesting is this source puts everyday illnesses like colds, flu, stomach bugs right up there with the worst of the worst.
Really? Why?
It's all about the immediate, the really unpleasant symptoms
Oh, yeah.
and how it just stops you from doing anything.
It's the disruption, the feeling miserable, the knowing you're contagious.
Exactly. It's the inconvenience, the constant cleaning, the feeling like you're trapped in your own body. They even ask, like, how could anyone see anything good about being sick?
Fair point. It's hard to find a silver lining when you feel that awful.
It is. But it's a good reminder that suffering, it comes in many forms. Even the small stuff can feel huge when you're going through it.
No kidding. Okay, let's get a little philosophical now. What about the devil? You know, like the embodiment of evil.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. There are two related but slightly different perspectives here.
Okay, lay it on me.
So for people who believe in a literal devil, Satan is the ultimate source of evil. The one who abused free will tempts humanity.
Right, classic bad guy.
Yeah. But for others, even just the idea of a being or a force that represents pure evil, that's the worst thing.
So regardless of whether it's a guy with horns or just a concept, the very idea of that much badness is what's terrifying.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it. So what does the source say would be different without this evil force.
They argue that the world would be fundamentally different, like united in good, free from the worst cruelty.
So it's like blaming this one entity for a lot of the bad stuff.
Yeah, attributing the origins of malice to a single powerful force.
Whether you believe in a literal devil or not, it's a way to try and understand evil.
Exactly. Okay, now we're going to talk about something incredibly sensitive and horrific. Rape.
Yeah, I can't imagine how hard this must be for some listeners to even hear about.
I know. And the source describes it as the worst type of torture, and they're very clear that the focus is on the lasting emotional and psychological damage, like way beyond any physical injury.
The stars you can't see.
Right. And they talk about the potential for disgust, anger, even suicidal thoughts in survivors. It's about a violation of autonomy, of self.
It takes away your sense of safety, your control.
Yeah. And the source also points out that there's the potential for unwanted pregnancy and often a lack of support systems.
It just compounds the trauma.
It does.
So where does this fall on the list?
It's interesting because while war might be ranked higher numerically in some places, the source here says without war, the U.S. wouldn't exist.
Okay, that's a complicated thought.
It is. It's like acknowledging the impact of war but still condemning rape in the strongest possible terms.
Two very different things, obviously.
Absolutely.
Okay, moving on. Let's talk about racism.
This one is condemned as discrimination based solely on how someone looks.
It's so superficial.
Right. And the source is very strong in their opinion. They basically say people who are racist belong in mental institutions.
Wow.
It's seen as something you can't control and a total violation of the idea that we should celebrate diversity.
Like, it goes against basic human decency.
Exactly. And they compare racists to Hitler.
Strong words.
It's a powerful statement about the perceived evil of that ideology.
You can't really get much worse than that comparison.
No. Okay, now we're getting to what the source calls the newcomers to the list, starting with transphobia.
Okay, so this is a relatively new term, right?
Relatively, yeah.
Okay.
And it's described as hatred towards people just because they're different.
Because of their gender identity.
Right. And the source is very clear. They say it's the worst thing on this list, without a doubt.
It's a powerful statement. Like, this is absolutely unacceptable.
Exactly. And then the other newcomer is kind of unexpected, being short.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they present it as the worst thing ever because of all the perceived negative social implications, like feeling less powerful, overlooked, and the idea that height somehow equals social value.
Oh, yeah. I can see how that would be frustrating.
Right. It speaks to those societal expectations around masculinity, too.
Like the tall, dark, and handsome stereotype.
Yeah. But it's a reminder that even things that might seem superficial can really impact how people feel about themselves.
Makes you think about all the ways we judge each other, consciously or not.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What else is on this list?
There's a whole bunch more that the source calls the contenders. It's a mix of other experiences and issues that people brought up.
Like what?
Well, there's animal abuse. And this one really gets a strong reaction. The source is careful to differentiate it from, like, killing for survival.
Right, so we're talking about cruelty.
Exactly. They even specifically mentioned that dog festival in Yulin.
Oh, yeah. That's horrific. It's hard to even think about.
It is. And the way they talk about it, it's clear that the vulnerability of animals just amplifies that sense of outrage.
Yeah, they can't defend themselves. It's just wrong. What else?
There's pain and injury, which they define really broadly. It's not just physical, it's emotional, social. They even mention things like racism and depression.
It's about suffering in all its forms.
Right. Okay, what else? Bullying gets a lot of attention, and the focus is on its impact on mental health, even leading to thoughts of suicide.
It's a serious issue.
Yeah. And they mentioned the movie Zombies, which I thought was interesting.
As an example of bullying.
Yeah, they say it has a good anti-bullying message. It's a reminder these themes are everywhere, even in pop culture.
You wouldn't necessarily expect it from a zombie movie. Okay, what else?
There's poverty.
Yeah.
And the way it's presented is really stark. Like the visible suffering, especially of children.
It's hard to ignore those images.
It is.
Yeah.
And they talk about wanting to help, but often feeling powerless.
The scale of the problem can be overwhelming.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Then there's physical abuse, which they connect to more extreme violence, like it can be a precursor.
A cycle of abuse?
Yeah. And there's a personal story shared, someone who was locked up by their parents as a kid. Really disturbing stuff.
It highlights how deeply damaging that kind of abuse can be.
It does. Okay, then there's child abuse, which the source really challenges us to think about.
In what way?
They question that inherent power dynamic between adults and children, and they even say things like yelling, mockery. Those can be forms of abuse.
So it's broadening the definition.
Yeah, it's about recognizing all the ways we can impact kids, even unintentionally.
It makes you really think about your own actions.
Right.
What else?
Torture is condemned, obviously, for the pain, but also because it's often done for, like, really dumb reasons. They say there are always better ways to get information.
Like diplomacy, reason, things like that.
Yeah. And they use examples like crucifixion to really drive home the point.
It's a stark reminder of human cruelty.
It is. Then there's pedophilia, which they just label the most disgusting thing that exists.
Can't argue with that.
No.
Okay, keep going.
Hatred and heartbreak are kind of linked. And they suggest that heartbreak might actually last longer than death or pain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they even share a personal story about being cheated on multiple times. It's about that deep emotional wound that doesn't heal easily.
That can be devastating.
It can. Then there's sexism, which they illustrate through examples of objectification and unequal treatment.
It's about recognizing those everyday ways that women are marginalized.
Right.
Okay, what else?
Capitalism gets called out for the wealth gap, the idea that poor people can't create change.
So it's bringing in that socioeconomic angle.
Exactly.
What else?
Anxiety gets described as super intense, often misunderstood, and how it can impact your whole life.
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah. Suicide is framed as a tragic consequence of things like depression and bullying. They urge us to stop blaming the victims and try to understand.
It's a plea for compassion.
It is. And lastly, global warming.
Okay, the big one.
Right. They present it as a planet-ending threat. And they even ask, like, why isn't it ranked higher on some of these lists?
I mean, it's definitely up there in terms of potential consequences.
Yeah.
So after this deep dive into all these top 10 worst things ever, what stands out to you?
Honestly, it's the sheer range of things that people consider the absolute worst. We've got everything from global conflicts to feeling short. It's about how we define suffering individually and collectively.
And the things we value.
Yeah, like the strong reactions to anything that hurts the vulnerable, the innocent.
It says a lot about who we are as a society, what we hold dear.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, I have a final thought for you. After hearing all this, what resonates most with you? What hits home? What does this tell us about what we fear most, about what we value most in the human experience? We encourage you to keep thinking about all this, maybe revisit those lists, those ideas that were shared. It's a conversation worth having, even if it's about the dark stuff.